You're standing in the kitchen alone, looking for your keys, and without really deciding to, you say it out loud. Keys. Where are the keys? Nobody's listening. There's no one to answer you. And yet some part of your brain clearly thought this sentence needed to exist in the air, not just in your head. You've probably caught yourself doing this 100 times and brushed it off as a quirky habit, maybe even felt a little embarrassed by it, like it's a sign of something slightly unhinged. But talking to yourself isn't a glitch. It's a documented, functional piece of how your mind works, and understanding why you do it changes how you should feel about it. To understand where this habit comes from, you have to go back almost a century to the Soviet psychologist Lev Vygotsky. In the 1930s, Vygotsky was watching children play, and he noticed something that earlier researchers had mostly dismissed as meaningless noise. Young children constantly narrate themselves out loud while doing things, stacking blocks while saying, "This one goes here," struggling with a puzzle piece while muttering, "No, not that way." The dominant view at the time, associated with the psychologist Jean Piaget, was that this speech was basically a symptom of immaturity. Egocentric speech, he called it, a sign that young children hadn't yet learned to separate their own perspective from everyone else's, chattering without real purpose, a habit that would simply fade as the child matured. Vygotsky disagreed, and his alternative explanation turned out to be the more accurate one. He proposed that this out-loud self-narration wasn't meaningless at all. It was a tool. Children, he argued, first learn to regulate their behavior through language spoken to them by others, a parent saying, "Careful, slow down," while they climb. Over time, children start directing that same kind of guidance at themselves, out loud, because they haven't yet developed the ability to do it silently. Vygotsky called this private speech, and he saw it as a genuine stepping stone, language gradually moving from something social, spoken between people, to something private, spoken to oneself, to something internal, thought without sound at all. Under this model, talking to yourself isn't a failure to think properly. It's an early, visible version of thinking itself, caught in the act before it fully retreats inside your skull. Here's the detail that should catch your attention. Vygotsky was specifically describing children. So why are you, a fully grown adult with decades of practice, thinking silently, still occasionally saying things out loud to an empty kitchen? This is where the psychologist Adam Winsler at George Mason University picks up the story. Winsler has spent much of his career documenting something that earlier research mostly ignored. Private speech doesn't actually disappear in adulthood. It goes underground, mostly, but it resurfaces reliably under specific conditions. In a 2006 study, Winsler and his colleagues found that the overwhelming majority of adults report murmuring to themselves at least occasionally. 46 out of 48 women in one sample admitted to it outright. And across Winsler's broader body of research, a consistent pattern shows up again and again. Adults are far more likely to talk to themselves out loud when a task gets harder, when they hit a snag, when the automatic, silent version of thinking stops being enough. Searching for keys is a perfect example of exactly this kind of moment. It's not hard in the sense of being complicated, but it's disorganized. There's no clear next step, no obvious place to look first. And according to Winsler's research, that specific kind of low-grade cognitive friction, not knowing quite what to do next, is one of the most reliable triggers for private speech to resurface, even in adults who otherwise think silently almost all the time. In other words, you didn't regress by muttering out loud. Your brain reached for an old, useful tool the moment silent thinking stopped being efficient enough on its own. But this still leaves an open question. Why would saying something out loud actually help mechanically? Thinking the word keys and saying the word keys both involve the same underlying concept. What does adding sound actually do? This is where a very different kind of study comes in, one that wasn't about children or self-regulation at all, but about vision. In 2012, the psychologists Gary Lupyan at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Daniel Swingley at the University of Pennsylvania ran an experiment built around a simple visual search task. Participants were shown a cluttered image and asked to find a specific object, a banana among dozens of unrelated items, for example. In some trials, they searched in silence. In other trials, they were asked to say the object's name out loud, repeatedly, while searching. Saying the word out loud measurably sped up how quickly people found the object, typically by somewhere between 50 and 100 milliseconds. A small but real and consistent effect. Lupyan and Swingley's explanation is called the label feedback hypothesis, and it's a genuinely strange idea once you sit with it. Actually hearing a word, even when you're the one saying it, appears to temporarily sharpen the visual system's ability to detect the thing that word refers to. Hearing banana doesn't just remind you what you're looking for. It briefly makes your visual system a slightly better banana detector. There was an important limit to this effect, though. It only helped when the word had a strong, reliable connection to what the object actually looked like. If the association between the name and the visual target was weak or unusual, saying the word out loud stopped helping and sometimes even slowed people down. The boost wasn't magic. It was your brain briefly leaning on a well-worn connection between sound and sight, and that lean only works if the connection is already strong. Put Vygotsky and Winsler's research next to Lupyan and Swingley's, and a fuller picture starts to form. Vygotsky explains where this habit came from developmentally, language turning inward over childhood, but never fully disappearing. Winsler explains when it resurfaces in adults, specifically under moments of difficulty or disorganization, when silent thought alone isn't cutting it. And Lupyan and Swingley explain why it might actually work, not as some kind of comforting ritual, but as a real, measurable boost to how your visual system processes the world in that moment. None of these 3 lines of research were built to fit together. Vygotsky was studying preschoolers in the 1930s. Winsler was surveying adults in the 2000s. Lupyan and Swingley were running a vision science lab experiment in 2012, but they converge on the same underlying idea from 3 completely different angles. Talking to yourself isn't a sign that something in your thinking has broken down. It's a sign that your brain is doing something it has always done, reaching for an older, more externalized version of thought, the moment the newer, quieter version needs backup. Let's slow down on Vygotsky's original observations for a moment because the detail he noticed is easy to skip past. He didn't just observe that children talk while playing. He tracked exactly when this self-narration got louder or quieter and found a specific pattern. When a task was going smoothly, private speech tended to fade into the background or disappear almost entirely. But the moment a child hit an obstacle, a puzzle piece that wouldn't fit, a block tower that kept toppling, the self-talk would spike, becoming more frequent, more detailed, more clearly aimed at solving the specific problem in front of them. This detail matters enormously because it means Vygotsky wasn't describing a constant background hum of childish chatter. He was describing something that responded dynamically to difficulty, ramping up exactly when a young mind needed more scaffolding, and quieting down once things were running smoothly again. That's not noise. That's a tool being deployed precisely when it's useful, and set aside when it isn't. Vygotsky's broader theory, sometimes called the socio-cultural theory of cognitive development, proposed something that felt radical at the time. He argued that higher mental functions, the ability to plan, to regulate your own attention, to reason through a problem, don't emerge purely from inside an individual brain in isolation. They start out as social, interpersonal processes. things done between a child and a caregiver, and only gradually become internalized as private, individual capacities. Private speech sits right at the hinge point of that transformation. It's language that used to be aimed outward, at another person, now being redirected inward, at the self, but not yet fully silent. This is why Vygotsky considered private speech developmentally important, rather than embarrassing or immature. In his framework, a child who talks to themselves while solving a puzzle isn't behind a child who solves it silently. In many cases, they're actively in the middle of building the exact cognitive machinery that will eventually let them solve harder puzzles silently later, once the tool has been used enough times to fully internalize. Winsler didn't just find that private speech resurfaces under difficulty in general. His research, along with collaborators studying task performance more specifically, found that the content of adult private speech tends to shift depending on exactly what kind of difficulty someone is facing. When adults are working through a genuinely unfamiliar problem, their self-talk tends to be more instructional, walking themselves through steps, almost coaching themselves the way a patient parent might coach a child. When the difficulty is more about frustration or a stalled process, like searching for misplaced keys, the self-talk tends to be shorter, more repetitive, closer to simply restating the goal to keep it active in mind. Keys, where would I have put the keys? This distinction matters because it shows private speech isn't one single behavior with one single function. It's a flexible tool that adapts its form to whatever kind of cognitive support the moment actually requires, sometimes offering step-by-step guidance, sometimes simply keeping a goal from slipping out of active memory while your eyes scan a cluttered counter. Winsler's research also found something that pushes back gently against any lingering stigma around this behavior. Across his studies, people who used more task-relevant private speech during difficult problems didn't perform worse. In many conditions, they performed better, or at least showed better persistence, staying engaged with a difficult task for longer rather than giving up. The old assumption that muttering to yourself signals confusion or incompetence gets the causality backwards. The muttering isn't a symptom of struggling, is frequently part of how people successfully work through struggling. Now let's go back to Lupyan and Swingley's visual search research, because there's a piece of their methodology worth adding. Their experiments didn't just compare silence to speech in a general sense. They specifically varied how strong the connection was between a word and its visual target, and tracked how that changed the size of the effect. For an object with a very typical prototypical appearance, a banana that looks like a textbook banana, saying the word out loud produced a clear, reliable speed boost. But when researchers used images of the same object type that looked unusual or atypical, a banana photographed at a strange angle or partially obscured, the benefit of saying the word shrank, and in some cases reversed slightly, with self-directed speech very mildly slowing people down. Lupyan's broader theoretical framework, the label feedback hypothesis, treats spoken words as more than communication tools. In this model, a word functions almost like a temporary filter applied directly to perception itself, briefly amplifying the visual features that typically belong to that word's most common referent. Saying banana doesn't just remind your memory what a banana is, it appears to temporarily retune your visual system toward yellow, curved, elongated shapes, making an actual banana easier to pick out of clutter, but only if the banana you're looking for actually resembles the mental template that word usually activates. This is a genuinely strange thing to sit with. Something as simple as saying a word out loud seems to reach backward and briefly reshape how your visual cortex is prioritizing information, not metaphorically, but as a measurable change in reaction time. Your voice, in that moment, is doing something closer to recalibrating a sensor than simply communicating a thought. Put all three of these threads together, and the picture becomes more than the sum of its parts. Vygotsky shows that self-directed speech is a genuine cognitive tool present from early childhood that helps regulate behavior during difficulty. Winsler shows that this tool never actually disappears in adulthood. It just goes quiet until difficulty specifically calls it back out, and that using it is associated with better persistence, not worse performance. And Lupyan and Swingley show a plausible mechanical reason why speaking specifically, rather than simply thinking, might carry a real perceptual advantage in certain situations, briefly sharpening the exact sensory channel you need most. None of this means you need to start narrating your entire day out loud. The research doesn't suggest self-talk is universally beneficial in every context, and plenty of the time, silent thought works perfectly well on its own. What it does suggest is that the specific moments when you spontaneously start talking to yourself, the disorganized key search, the frustrating assembly instructions, the decision you can't quite settle in your head, are not random malfunctions. They're moments your brain has, largely without asking your permission, identified as ones where an older, externalized form of thinking might genuinely help. So the next time you catch yourself narrating a search for your keys, or muttering instructions to yourself while assembling furniture, or talking through a decision out loud in an empty room, you don't need to feel self-conscious about it. You're not failing to think like an adult. You're doing something closer to the opposite, reaching back through decades of cognitive development, all the way to a tool your mind built when you were 3 years old. Because right now, in this moment, it's still the right tool for the job. You're standing in the kitchen, alone, looking for your keys. And this time when you hear yourself say it out loud, keys, where are the keys? You don't feel embarrassed. You recognize it for what it actually is, your mind, quietly and efficiently, doing exactly what it's supposed to do.